At 7:42 on the morning of August 17, 1942, Captain Paul Gunn crouched under the wing of a Douglas A-20 Havoc at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, watching mechanics weld 50 caliber machine guns into a nose compartment that used to belong to a bombardier. 43 years old, 21 years already behind him in the Navy, and a wife and 4 children sitting in a Japanese internment camp in Manila that he had no way of reaching. The 5th Air Force was losing bombers faster than replacements could arrive. In July alone, the 3rd Attack Group had lost 11 A-20s trying to hit Japanese convoys from altitude, bombardiers missing moving ships entirely, and every time a crew dropped low enough to actually hit something, deck guns shredded them on the way in. Gunn had a blunt solution: fly low enough to skip bombs off the water like stones, and overwhelm the deck guns with enough forward firepower that nobody left alive down there could aim back. The problem was arithmetic. The A-20's factory nose carried 4 30 caliber guns that bounced harmlessly off ship armor. Gunn needed 50 caliber guns instead, 4 of them, mounted where the bombardier used to sit, 1,700 rounds a minute of combined fire. And General George Kenney, the new 5th Air Force commander, gave him exactly 1 week to prove the idea worked. Gunn didn't wait on requisition forms. He stripped 50 caliber guns off wrecked P-39s and P-40s, whose pilots were already dead and whose airframes would never fly again, welded them onto a steel frame inside the nose, and immediately discovered the obvious problem. 200 pounds of guns and ammunition up front shifted the center of gravity hard forward. The test flight nearly killed the pilot outright. The Havoc barely climbed and wanted to nose straight into the ground. Gunn spent 2 days moving equipment aft and adjusting tail trim until the 2nd test pilot came back, saying the aircraft flew like it was angry, which, as far as Gunn was concerned, meant it flew. On September 12th, 16 modified A-20s hit the Japanese airfield at Buna at treetop height, guns hammering the whole approach. 14 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground, every anti-aircraft position suppressed, 0 A-20s lost. Kenney wanted more immediately, but the Havoc's range couldn't clear the Owen Stanley Mountains to reach the targets that mattered most. Gunn needed a bigger platform, the B-25 Mitchell. If you want to see how Pappy Gunn's impossible gunship changed the entire Pacific War, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Gunn. By December, he'd pulled the bombardier and nose guns off a B-25C entirely and packed in 4 50 calibers up front, 4 more in external cheek mounts, and rotated the top turret to fire forward. 10 forward-firing guns on an aircraft that had shipped from the factory with almost none. The ground crews started calling it Pappy's Folly. Gunn flew the prototype to Charters Towers, so nose-heavy, he had to hold full back pressure on the stick through the whole climb-out. And once airborne, the thing flew like a destroyer with wings. Kenney ordered 12 more conversions on the spot, and the 81st Air Depot Group in Townsville worked 18-hour shifts until 30 strafers stood ready for combat by February 1943. Wright Field's engineers in Ohio studied the blueprints Kenney sent stateside and sent back a formal recommendation to ground every modified B-25 immediately. The balance was wrong. The airframe couldn't handle it. The whole concept was impractical on paper. Kenney happened to be in Washington when that message landed. He walked straight into General Hap Arnold's office, where the Wright Field engineers were already lined up to explain exactly why the impossible airplane couldn't work, and told them plainly that 12 of those impossible airplanes had just annihilated a Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. Arnold reportedly ran the engineers out of his office on the spot. That battle began with intercepted Japanese naval codes on February 28, 1943. 8 transports and 8 destroyer escorts leaving Rabaul, carrying nearly 7,000 troops toward Lae, on New Guinea's north coast. With monsoon weather, the Japanese believed would hide them from Allied bombers for the full crossing. They were right about the weather, and catastrophically wrong about what that weather could no longer stop. High-altitude B-17 strikes on March 2nd dropped 137 bombs through cloud breaks and sank exactly nothing. Conventional bombing simply couldn't hit a moving ship from 3 miles up. The convoy kept coming, scattering along the New Guinea coast that night, expecting to reach Lae under fighter cover by dawn on March 4th. At 06:30 on March 3rd, 137 Allied aircraft assembled over Cape Ward Hunt, B-17s, to draw the defensive fire high first, then Gunn's strafers coming in low at masthead height, gun range point blank. 12 B-25s, led by Captain Ed Larner, hit the convoy in line abreast at wave-top height, 168 forward-firing guns across 12 aircraft opening up at 800 yards and walking 50-caliber rounds across the water like a chainsaw, shredding bridges and killing anti-aircraft crews before they ever traversed their weapons. The transport Kyokusei Maru took 3 skip-bombed hits and was dead in the water inside 30 seconds, sinking within the hour. The Teo Maru tried to outrun aircraft, doing 240 knots at 15 knots flat out. 4 strafers bracketed her from both sides, gunned down her bridge crew including the captain, dropped 8 bombs with 5 hits, and watched her break in half and sink in 6 minutes. Japanese soldiers still below decks when she split. By 0900, the entire convoy was scattered across 40 square miles of burning ocean, 5 transports sinking, 2 destroyers crippled, the rest making a doomed run for Layer A. The strafers returned at 1400 with fresh ammunition and no Japanese fighter cover left to contest the sky. The transport Oigawa Maru took 12 bomb hits in the second wave, and its magazine detonated in an explosion visible from Port Moresby, 130 miles away, taking roughly 1,800 soldiers with it in 3 seconds and leaving no wreckage worth the name. By evening on March 3rd, all 8 transports and 4 destroyers were destroyed. Of nearly 7,000 Japanese troops who'd left Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 reached Lae. Allied losses across the entire battle: 4 aircraft, 13 airmen. MacArthur called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats in history, and Japan never again attempted to reinforce New Guinea by convoy. Kenny's message to Washington on March 5th ran one paragraph: 12 B-25 strafers had just destroyed an entire Japanese convoy, and he wanted the forward gun package integrated into every B-25 coming off the assembly line, immediately. Arnold called North American Aviation's president that same afternoon and told him he was sending the man who'd designed the modifications in person. Gunn didn't want to go. His family had been interned at Santo Tomas since January 1942, and California was the wrong direction entirely. But Kenny made it an order, promising 6 weeks and no more. North American's engineers in Long Beach studied Gunn's hand-drawn sketches and asked about stress calculations he'd never run and wind tunnel testing he'd never done. He'd tested everything by simply flying it. When they pointed out that muzzle blast from the 50 calibers would peel the aluminum skin around the cheek gun mounts, Gunn showed them the blast tubes he'd already welded to solve exactly that problem, extended out past the propeller arc. 2 weeks of reverse engineering later, the factory-built B-25G rolled off the line on May 10, 1943, carrying a 75mm cannon in the nose, alongside the 50 calibers, a shell the same caliber as a Sherman tank's main gun, capable of holding a destroyer below the waterline in a single hit. The design kept evolving past that. The B-25H added more cheek guns for 14 forward-firing weapons total, and the B-25J dropped the cannon entirely in favor of 18 forward-firing 50 calibers, the most heavily armed production bomber ever built, with nearly 4,900 delivered to combat theaters worldwide. Gunn made it back to the Pacific in exactly 6 weeks, his family still in Manila, and the strafers he'd built kept hunting. 16 barges destroyed near Finchhofen in April, 12 cargo ships sunk at Wewak Harbor in May. The oil facilities at Balikpapan hit in June. The Japanese stopped moving supplies by daylight. The strafers simply learned to hunt by radar at night instead, skip bombing from 50 feet in total darkness, coordinating with PT boats that lit targets with searchlights at the last possible second. Japanese crews had a name for the modified B-25s by then: the Black Death. On November 2, 1943, 59 B-25s among 137 Allied aircraft hit Rabaul Harbor through phosphorus smoke that blinded the anti-aircraft gunners, attacking from every direction at once. 30 ships hit in 15 minutes. 5 sunk outright. Rabaul finished as a forward supply base. Gunn flew that mission himself at 44 years old, a staff officer with no obligation to be in the cockpit at all, except that every mission put him one step closer to Manila. The intelligence coming out of Santo Tomas kept getting worse. Rations cut, medicine gone, prisoners dying of malnutrition, and word that camp guards had orders to execute everyone if Allied forces got too close. Gunn told Kenny he wanted to fly the first mission over Manila the day liberation began. He never got the chance the way he'd planned it. On November 27, 1944, at 0330 hours, 56 Japanese bombers hit Tacloban Airfield. With no warning, the radar operators caught in time. Gunn was in the operations tent, reviewing the next morning's strike, when the first bombs landed 200 yards away, close enough that the blast wave knocked him flat, and shrapnel tore through the canvas, one fragment opening his leg, another his shoulder. He tried to stand and check on his aircraft before the medical officer even reached him. He made it 30 feet before he went down. Surgeons found the shrapnel had severed an artery and told him flatly he wouldn't fly again for 6 months at minimum, likely longer. Injuries serious enough to qualify him for medical retirement outright. At 45 years old with 26 combined years of Navy and Army service already behind him. Gunn told them he wasn't going anywhere until his family was free. The Battle of Manila opened on February 3, 1945. American troops fighting house to house through a city the Japanese had sworn to defend to the last street. Santo Tomas was liberated that same day. 3,700 Allied prisoners freed. Gunn's wife Polly down to 89 pounds. His daughter Julia to 63. His son Nathaniel fighting malaria. His youngest daughter fighting dysentery. All 4 of them alive after 3 years. Gunn flew to Manila the next day against direct medical orders. Still bandaged, still on a cane, cleared for light duty only, and found his family in the makeshift camp hospital, 40 pounds lighter than she remembered him, and gone completely gray, so changed that Polly didn't recognize her own husband until he said her name. The reunion lasted 4 hours before he flew back to Leyte. The war wasn't over yet, even if his part in the fighting effectively was. By war's end, North American had built roughly 9,600 B-25s total, nearly 5,000 of them Strafer variants tracing directly back to Gunn's original field modifications. Those aircraft sank over 800 Japanese ships, destroyed more than 2,000 aircraft on the ground, and were credited with an estimated 85,000 enemy soldiers killed. Numbers that made the commerce destroyer concept Wright Field's engineers had once declared impossible into arguably the single most effective anti-shipping weapon of the entire Pacific theater. The Army retired Gunn as a full colonel on June 30, 1948, on medical disability at 48 years old. He went back to the Philippines and rebuilt Philippine Airlines almost from nothing. 3 war surplus C-47s at first, growing route by route across the archipelago until it reached Hong Kong, Bangkok, Singapore, and by 1956, San Francisco. The Philippine government awarded him the Distinguished Service Star in 1947, President Manuel Roxas presenting it personally. The United States had already given him the Distinguished Flying Cross, with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and 9 Purple Hearts. General Kenny wrote afterward that Gunn was the most valuable man in the entire 5th Air Force, that without the Strafer modifications, Bismarck Sea would have gone the other way, and without Bismarck Sea, the road to the Philippines might never have opened at all. He never stopped flying after the war. Manila to Cebu, Cebu to Davao, Davao to Hong Kong, constantly in motion, some of his pilots said, as though still outrunning something that had never quite let him land. On October 11, 1957, flying a chartered twin-engine Beechcraft from Manila to Baguio, on what should have been a routine 140-mile hop, he flew into weather that deteriorated far faster than forecast. Heavy rain and turbulence over the Cordillera Mountains. Radio contact lost at 10:47. Wreckage found 3 days later on a mountainside. Paul Pappy Gunn was 57 years old. 6,000 people attended his funeral in the Philippines. American veterans, Philippine Airlines employees, former Santo Tomas prisoners among them. His obituary called him a war hero, and left it mostly at that, unable to capture what the numbers actually meant. Nearly 5,000 strafers built on his design, 800 ships sunk, 2,000 aircraft destroyed, a concept that reshaped how bombers were used for every air force that studied it afterward. Echoes of it still visible in every modern gunship built with forward-firing weapons since. Most people who fly through the airline he rebuilt from 3 surplus transports have never once heard his name. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Everyone tells YouTube to put this story in front of more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories like this one out of the archive every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family served, we want to hear it. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure Pappy Gunn doesn't disappear into silence.